their subject of expertise. Final topic of today's panel will be titanium sponge. Of course, the presentation wouldn't be complete if it didn't start off with a disclaimer on forward-looking statements. And rather than bore you with it, you have the option to read it at your convenience when the slides are posted online. Some of this is going to be repetitive towards what some of the speakers earlier discussed, but the six topics we're going to review are sponge import statistics, looking at capacity utilization, feedstock supply concerns, as David discussed in great depth earlier, some of the sponge supply changes worldwide, looking at USGS statistics, and then touch up with some national security and trade climate issues happening. Starting off with sponge import statistics, since 2014, sponge imports have been on a general uptrend, and from 2016 to 2017, you can see they jumped approximately 50%, going from 16,000 tons to 24,000 metric tons, and are poised to climb higher, perhaps another 25% from 2017 to 30,000 metric tons in 2019. Based on extrapolating year-to-date import statistics through June. Looking at the country of origin mix, our 2019 estimates would put Japanese suppliers at record levels, while at the same time seeing a resurgence from Kazakhstan. Imports from China, Ukraine, and Russia have fallen dramatically in recent years, such that they're virtually non-existent in the U.S. at this time. It's difficult to discern the reasons for the dramatic increases with sponge imports because USGS statistics on milk product growth don't necessarily show this type of trajectory. And coupled with substantial revert availability, it's a little surprising. Begs a few questions. How much of this is related to low inventories over in the States? How much is related to closing the ATI Raleigh plant? How much is related to melters taking positions due to fears of possible trade actions? In my estimate, it's likely a combination of all three of those. As you break down the import statistics into dollars, you can see that sponge prices from the top importers have been in decline since before 2014, which is interesting when you recognize that strong demand, coupled with rising feedstock costs that David showed us earlier, would suggest the opposite to be true. It is clear that pricing pressures on mill products from the OEMs are trickling down to sponge producers, which begs a few more questions. Is this a sustainable position? How long can this last, and how healthy are today's sponge producers? Looking at historical sponge production since 1995, you can clearly see a shift over time on where sponge is coming from in terms of volume and mix, particularly with the rise of China. It is evident the industry expanded too quickly in anticipation of increased next-generation aircraft build rates when the majority of those programs experienced significant delays. As sponge production peaked in 2012, it led to excess inventories throughout the supply chain, forcing numerous producers to either curtail production or shut down operations altogether. Furthermore, the abundance of revert combined with cold hearth melt expansions complicated a situation for sponge producers as melters became more and more proficient at recycling revert, delaying the recovery. And you can see 7 years later, we still are well below that 2012 peak. Moving into sponge capacities, there have been a number of moving parts with both expansions and contractions over the years. In 2013, Roscoe reported global capacity at 332,000 metric tons and reported a drop down to 274,000 in 2016. I excluded some small production out of India from these numbers. You wouldn't even see it on the chart. In his presentation in Vienna earlier this year, Sylvain Gaillard estimated 2019 capacity at 270,000 metric tons. China accounts for the majority of the overall growth since 2004, where they were only 6% of global capacity. Today, China is nearly 40%, which translates to China owning 100,000 metric tons of the 170,000 metric ton expansion. or nearly 60% of global growth. At the ITA conference in Vienna a few months ago, Sylvain presented estimates of capacity utilization, and he estimates that global utilization is at 80%, which was mentioned earlier. When you break it down a little differently and combine the United States, Japan, Russia, and Kazakhstan, utilization is at approximately 90%, whereas China and the Ukraine are running below 70%. This chart's a little busy, maybe difficult to see, but reiterating, it is estimated that 80% of the 216,000 metric tons of the 270,000 metric ton global capacity is being utilized. Therefore, there's roughly 53,000 metric tons available on the market. Where does the available capacity exist today? Well, if you isolate the United States, Japan, Kazakhstan, and Russia, it would appear there's less than 17,000 metric tons available from prime qualified aerospace producers. The other 37,000 metric tons, or nearly 70% of available capacity, would have to come from China or the Ukraine. Touching on the feedstock situation, earlier David presented TZMI's view of the sponge feedstocks market, signaling difficult times ahead for sponge producers. While TimeMet and other producers continue to report adequate supply outlook, it's clear they're being squeezed when you look at the import prices chart I presented earlier and combine this with TZMI's reported feedstock prices. This chart compares both import sponge price trends with feedstock price trends, and you can see the two are heading in opposite directions, suggesting challenges are ahead for sponge producers. This is TZMI's high-level take on feedstock supplies presented by Cameron Perks earlier this year at the conference in Vienna. While chloride, slag, and UGS appear to have adequate supply in the long run, rutile is facing supply challenges as demand continues to grow. All producers will be challenged to source high-grade feedstocks, while those tied closely to rutile will be especially challenged, perhaps requiring capital investment to upgrade facilities to increase flexibility and remain competitive. The question on that, though, is where do the funds come to support these capital investments that may be necessary when you look at the way producers are being squeezed today with the lower pricing and higher feedstock costs? They continue to operate on very thin margins. Another look at TZMI's reported price activity for feedstocks using 2016 as a base year, where you can see that chloride slag to Europe has climbed roughly 21%, while bulk rutile from Australia is up 33%. What does this mean to a sponge producer? Well, if you take basic chemistry math, it would suggest that nearly every pound of sponge would require 2 pounds of 2 TiO2 units. Therefore, every $100 per metric ton of increase in feedstock price would translate to approximately 20 cents per kilo increase in sponge cost. At some point, someone's going to need to bear that cost in the future. Some of the recent developments we're aware of, David touched on this a little earlier, some of these include the announced expansions in China, where Limon Billions announced a 30,000 metric ton expansion that includes titanium sponge. However, the sponge volume is unknown, as the expansion includes other components of the titanium supply chain. In addition, Pangang announced the restart of the sponge line idled in 2013, which will bring an additional 5,000 tons online. And Chaoyang Jinda announced a 10,000 metric ton per year expansion to complete next year. Last week, it was announced that the joint venture between Toho and Tronox, formerly Crystal, commissioned sponge production at the Yanbu plant in Saudi Arabia with a stated capacity of 15,600 metric tons. In the Ukraine, there continues to be uncertainty about future control of the sponge plant. In July 2018, the Commercial Court of Zaporozhye ruled to terminate the agreement that transferred roughly 40% ownership to Telexis Trading Limited, which in essence returned the ownership to the state. A few appeals have ensued, and in March of this year, the Supreme Court of the Ukraine ruled. They overturned the decision in favor of Telexis. At this time, the plant is maintaining status quo, and we believe it is producing it slightly better than 60% capacity, but clearly an uncertain future as you look at the Ukraine situation. A quick look here at USGS statistics confirm that domestic sponge consumption is on an upward trend despite a slight decline in 2018, while excess inventory overhang from earlier in the decade has been depleted. All of this happening while sponge percentages as an overall ingot mix are on the decline, which can clearly be attributed to the cold hearth melt expansions and the ample revert availability on the market today. This would suggest, though, with the low inventories here domestically, and combined with the import statistics that we're seeing, that demand is robust in the future here for titanium sponge. Last topic here, touching on some of the national security issues happening in Washington. The Trump administration, as we all know, has been outspoken on their America First agenda, which is to align trade policy to the benefit of American manufacturing. In July 2017, he signed Executive Order 13806 titled Assessing and Strengthening the Manufacturing and Defense Industrial Base and Supply Chain Resiliency of the United States. The main focus here is identifying raw materials and goods, along with manufacturing capabilities of those goods, to identify single points of failure or limited resiliency that could pose risks to national defense. Titanium sponge has been identified as a single point of failure with one domestic producer, TiMet. In December 2017, Executive Order 13817 called a federal strategy to ensure secure and reliable supplies of critical minerals covers essential minerals deemed essential to both economic and national security. Again, titanium was listed as an ongoing concern in the report that was finalized in May 2018. I'm sure we've all heard about the Section 232 investigation from the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. This allows the federal government to erect trade barriers on the grounds of national security. Tariffs were imposed in March of 2018 for aluminum at 10% and steel at 25%. In September of 2018, TiMet submitted a petition for Section 232 protection. And in February 2019, the Department of Commerce initiated an investigation whereby they have 270 days to make a recommendation to the executive branch. And this recommendation is right around the corner. It's due in November. At that point, the president has 90 days to consider the recommendation. Recently, the Department of Commerce has sent out questionnaires to all related parties or interested parties to complete in support of their investigation. For any of you that do have a little bit of interest in this, many of you I'm sure do, I'd like to recommend, there was an article published in Forbes earlier this year by Ike Brannon. It was in April of 19. In that paper, he touched on a number of Section 232 issues that have been happening, but specifically he did identify titanium sponge as what he called a textbook case for why Section 232 exists compared to some of the other things that the government has been looking at. With that, this concludes this year's Supply Trends panel, and I hope you all have enjoyed the presentations made by all these speakers, in addition to the activities here in Mobile. I think we overshot our time slot, but I think if the speakers could stick around for a few minutes, if anybody has any questions, maybe meet individually.